The first shot came before anyone understood why. A deaf black teenager, 16 years old, was lying face down on the pavement, her body trembling as blood spread across the asphalt. Her name was Imani Johnson. She hadn't committed a crime. She hadn't threatened anyone. She simply couldn't hear the commands that were shouted at her. The officers claimed she was resisting. They said she had a weapon. But what the crowd saw, and what the cameras recorded, was a child holding up her phone, the same phone she used every day to translate sign language into words. That small device became her death sentence. And as she gasped for air, cuffed to a stretcher like a criminal, the press release was already drafted. Suspect resisted arrest. Officers feared for their safety. A statement polished to protect the uniform, not the truth. Imagine it. A girl who lived her whole life in silence, gunned down for the crime of not hearing fast enough. That's the America her father walked into when he reached the hospital. Machines beeped, doctors scrambled, and 2 armed guards stood over his daughter's bed as if she were the danger, as if a teenager clinging to life could still harm them. This wasn't law enforcement. This was brutality wrapped in paperwork, a system designed to smear the victim and shield the guilty. Neighbors who tried to speak were threatened. Videos were quietly taken down, and the girl who could not defend herself was painted as an aggressor in the town she had called home. But here's the part those officers never expected. The man who stepped into that hospital room wasn't just a father. Marcus Johnson was a former FBI agent. He had spent years tearing apart cover-ups, exposing police misconduct, and dragging corruption into the light. And now, with his daughter fighting for her life, the fight was personal. The silence of one deaf girl had been turned into a weapon against her. But Marcus was about to turn that silence into something else entirely. Evidence. Evidence that would ignite protests, trigger federal investigations, and destroy careers built on lies. Because this was never just a shooting. It was the first crack in a wall of corruption that thought it would never fall. And once the truth began to bleed out, no badge, no uniform, no false report would be able to stop it. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear. Machines beeped as if measuring time itself, each sound a reminder that 16-year-old Imani Johnson was still alive. Barely. Deaf since childhood, she lay cuffed to the bed like a criminal, even as doctors fought to keep her breathing. Her father, Marcus Johnson, walked in. A former FBI agent turned federal investigator, he had faced cartel bosses and corrupt precincts, but nothing prepared him for this. The sight of his daughter, shot for not hearing commands, shackled as if guilty, burned deeper than any case file he had ever touched. The officers guarding her muttered, "Department policy," when he demanded the cuffs removed. Marcus didn't shout. He memorized every word, every smirk, storing it as evidence. Years of training told him the truth. Maplewood PD wasn't protecting the public. They were protecting themselves. The town had seen this before. Maplewood's brick police station carried decades of buried complaints, racial profiling, unexplained injuries, intimidation. But this time, the silence cracked wide open. Cell phone footage was already spreading online, showing Imani holding up nothing but her phone as officers fired. The official statement, "Suspect resisted arrest," collapsed the moment hashtags like "Had Justice for Imani" began to trend. Marcus moved quickly. He interviewed nurses who whispered about gag orders, saved screenshots of threats made against witnesses, and documented every bruise on his daughter's restrained wrists. He knew the playbook. Delay, deflect, bury the truth. He wasn't about to let it happen again. By morning, the mayor gave his polished speech. "We ask the community to remain calm." The police chief stood beside him, jaw tight, repeating the familiar line. The officers feared for their lives. Marcus replayed their words in his mind like evidence in court. Fit the description. That was the excuse. The same tired phrase that had justified profiling for decades. Back in his hotel, Marcus pulled federal files. Maplewood PD had received thousands in grants for disability awareness training, yet not one course had been documented. The money was gone. The very training that could have saved his daughter's life had been pocketed long before she ever stood on that street. This wasn't negligence. It was corruption. But paper trails weren't enough. He needed proof that could not be twisted. He met quietly with community leaders, pastors, business owners. Fear was thick, but slowly cracks appeared. A store clerk admitted officers pressured him to delete his video. A neighbor whispered that phones had been seized at the scene. Marcus recorded every word, his case building one testimony at a time. Then came the turning point. A plain envelope slipped under his hotel door, no name, just a USB drive inside. On it, the missing bodycam footage. Unedited, undeniable. It showed everything. Imani frozen, phone raised, no weapon. Reed stepping forward, gun drawn, barking orders she could never hear. The shot rang out, cold and calculated. Marcus stared at the screen. It was the kind of evidence that didn't just ruin officers, it collapsed departments, forced federal oversight, ended political careers. He knew releasing it too soon would risk exposing whoever had leaked it. But holding it meant power. Timing was everything. For now, he kept it hidden. He let the protests outside the courthouse grow louder, candles becoming flames, chants echoing through Maplewood. "Hands up, don't shoot! Justice for the deaf!" Every hour that passed tightened the noose. Marcus wasn't just preparing to expose one shooting, he was preparing to dismantle an entire system. And Maplewood had no idea how much truth was about to crash down on it. The protests outside Maplewood's courthouse were no longer whispers. They had become a roar. Parents carried signs, students skipped class, ministers led marches through the streets. The chant, "Justice for Imani," echoed across every block. What had started as grief was transforming into a movement, and the police could feel the pressure closing in. Inside the department, the cover-up deepened. Officer Reed and Officer Calden were quietly placed on administrative leave, but the chief made sure the press release painted them as heroes forced into a split-second decision. Internal emails, later leaked, revealed the plan: delay the investigation, stall public outrage, and shift blame onto the victim. It was the same strategy Maplewood had used for decades, except this time the victim's father wasn't a powerless man begging for justice. He was Marcus Johnson. Marcus wasn't chasing headlines. He was building a case. Every night he reviewed the footage, cross-checking timestamps, matching angles with witness videos. He created a timeline so airtight it could stand in any federal courtroom. The bodycam leak was his ace, but he knew better than to play it first. A single video could be dismissed as taken out of context. What he needed was a chain of evidence so undeniable it would crush the department's defense before they even raised it. He found his leverage in the money trail. The missing disability training funds weren't just sloppy accounting. They were federal dollars, misused and hidden under fraudulent reports. That made it a federal crime. If he tied the corruption to the shooting, the FBI would have jurisdiction to tear the department apart from the inside. Still, corruption fought back. Witnesses who had agreed to talk suddenly went silent. One pastor's car was vandalized. A store clerk who had confessed about deleted footage received a citation for loitering outside his own shop. Fear was spreading like wildfire, and it was clear. Maplewood PD wasn't going to let its secrets surface without a fight. Marcus stayed calm. He had been here before. Pressure was the weapon of the guilty. Silence was the shield of the corrupt. He doubled down, contacting old bureau colleagues. Some hesitated. No one wanted to be dragged into small-town politics, but when he revealed the stolen grant money and the missing bodycam files, hesitation vanished. This wasn't politics anymore. It was federal fraud, civil rights violations, and police misconduct wrapped into one explosive package. By the end of the week, FBI vehicles rolled quietly into town. Agents didn't come with flashing lights or sirens. They came like shadows, blending into the protests, interviewing witnesses, requesting records the department thought it had hidden. Each knock on a door made the chief sweat. Each subpoena sent a shiver down the ranks. The wall of silence was cracking. Then came the second blow. A whistleblower from inside Maplewood PD contacted Marcus directly. This officer, terrified, voice trembling, revealed that the chief had ordered reports rewritten. The command was simple. Portray Imani as aggressive, emphasize furtive movements, erase any mention of her being deaf. The whistleblower handed Marcus copies of the drafts, side by side with the altered versions. It was the smoking gun of a cover-up. Marcus knew what it meant. He now had 3 pieces: stolen federal funds, falsified reports, and the unedited bodycam footage. Each on its own was damning. Together, they were fatal. The department could no longer hide. Protests grew into nightly vigils, the courthouse lawn filled with candles, the name Imani written in chalk across sidewalks. National media arrived, cameras rolling, headlines blasting. Deaf teen shot by police, cover-up alleged. What had started as a local scandal was fast becoming a national crisis. Through it all, Marcus never let emotion dictate his moves. He didn't rage in front of cameras. He didn't make threats. He simply gathered evidence, step by step, until Maplewood's lies collapsed under their own weight. And as he watched the protests from his hotel window, chants rising into the night, Marcus whispered the same words he had signed into his daughter's hand in the hospital. "You're not alone. They will hear you." Maplewood thought it had silenced her. Instead, her silence had become the loudest voice in America. The town of Maplewood had never seen pressure like this. What started as a few people holding candles outside the courthouse had grown into crowds that filled the square night after night. Chants carried through the streets. "Justice for Imani! Justice for the deaf!" On the other side, officers in riot gear stood lined up, trying to look strong, but inside the police department the panic was real. They weren't just facing angry neighbors. They were facing evidence they couldn't erase. Marcus Johnson sat in his hotel room with his laptop open, files scattered across the table. On his screen were 2 versions of the same report. The first draft described Imani standing frozen, phone raised, no threat. The second draft, the one the department released to the press, claimed she charged forward aggressively and brandished an object. Marcus compared the words to the uncut bodycam video he had received. The footage showed the truth. His daughter never moved toward them. She lifted her phone, her only tool to communicate, and was shot. That was it. That was the entire story. He had worked long enough inside the FBI to know the playbook. Deny the facts, drag out the timeline, let the public lose interest. But Maplewood's police hadn't counted on him being the one building the case. They thought he would break down as a grieving parent. Instead, he was sharper than ever. He interviewed witnesses quietly, documented everything, stored files on encrypted drives, and tracked down money trails no one else cared to check. What he found went far beyond the shooting. Maplewood PD had taken federal money for disability awareness training, programs that would have taught officers how to handle encounters with deaf or disabled citizens. That training never happened. The money was gone. It was fraud, plain and simple, and it connected directly to Imani's shooting. If the training had been done, the officers would have known how to respond. Instead, the funds had been stolen, and his daughter paid the price. Marcus wasn't alone anymore. National media had arrived. Protesters outside the courthouse were now joined by civil rights lawyers, pastors, and activists from neighboring towns. News vans broadcast live, showing not only the protests, but also the stone faces of officers trying to hold their ground. Politicians were starting to call Maplewood, demanding answers. The chief tried to calm the storm, giving the same tired line at press conferences. Our officers feared for their lives. This was a split-second decision. But no one believed it anymore. Then came the leak. A whistleblower inside the department called Marcus on a burner phone, their voice shaky. They confirmed that the chief had personally ordered the deletion of body cam footage, threatening anyone who questioned it. Servers had been wiped, backup drives destroyed. But the officer had saved copies, drafts of reports rewritten to make Imani look aggressive. Marcus now had the missing link, proof of an intentional cover-up, not just sloppy work. As if that wasn't enough, another bomb dropped. A major news outlet released leaked audio of officers laughing about the shooting. In the recording, one voice, believed to be Officer Reed, mocked the protests and joked about teaching the deaf girl a lesson. The outrage was immediate. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #PoliceAccountability and #JusticeForImani trended nationwide. For the first time, Maplewood wasn't just a small-town scandal, it was a national crisis. The chief grew desperate. He called for a town hall meeting, hoping to regain control. He walked on stage, flanked by lawyers, repeating his lines about outside agitators and community misunderstanding. But Marcus was there too, calm and steady, holding the one thing the department couldn't spin: the body cam. When the chief claimed the cameras had malfunctioned, Marcus stood, his voice low but steady. "Then explain this." He plugged in the drive, and the footage filled the screen. The room went silent. Reporters leaned forward. Citizens held their breath. On the screen, there was no malfunction. No missing frames. Just Imani, standing still, phone raised, eyes wide with fear. Then Reed raised his gun, barked commands she couldn't hear, and fired. The silence in the hall was crushing. No one could deny what they had just seen. The crowd erupted. Shouts filled the room. Protesters outside surged forward, chanting louder than ever. Reporters rushed to file stories. The chief tried to speak, but every word fell flat. His career ended in that moment, and he knew it. Reed and Calden's faces, once hidden, were now everywhere, on news screens, on social media, on protest signs. They weren't nameless officers anymore. They were the men who shot a deaf child and then lied about it. The next morning, federal agents arrived. They didn't sneak in quietly this time. They walked straight into Maplewood PD with warrants, seizing computers and boxes of files. They questioned officers one by one. They traced the stolen grant money. The department was no longer in control, the federal government was. Reed and Calden were taken into custody. Their lawyers tried to argue fear, but the video made it impossible. Every frame showed the truth. The chief claimed ignorance about the stolen funds and the falsified reports, but Marcus handed investigators every document, every draft, every timestamp. The evidence was airtight: fraud, abuse of power, civil rights violations, all laid bare. Maplewood PD, once untouchable in its small town, was now collapsing under the weight of federal scrutiny. For the people of Maplewood, the change was immediate. Vigils replaced clashes. Parents brought their children to the courthouse lawn, candles glowing against the night sky. "This is what truth looks like," one father said, holding his son's hand as cameras rolled. For Marcus, the fight wasn't about headlines. It was about his daughter. He sat at her bedside each night, signing into her hand, "You're not alone. They hear you now." She was still weak, but one night she squeezed his hand. It was small, but it was everything. The climax of Maplewood's story was never just about one shooting. It was about decades of silence breaking all at once. A town that had buried complaints for years could no longer hide. The cover-up had failed. The system had been dragged into the light, and the careers of the officers who pulled the trigger and the leaders who protected them were ending in real time. The chief was gone. The officers who pulled the trigger were in custody. Maplewood PD was under federal review. For most towns, that would have been the end. But for Marcus Johnson, it wasn't nearly enough. He had spent too many years inside the Bureau to believe corruption stopped at one shooting or one department. He knew the deeper you dug, the darker it got. And he was about to be proven right. The first twist came quietly. Federal auditors uncovered bank transfers linked to the stolen disability training funds. Those transfers didn't end in Maplewood. They led to accounts in the state capitol, tied to a political action committee that had financed the mayor's re-election. The money meant for officer training had been funneled upward, greasing palms far above the department's reach. Suddenly, it wasn't just a local scandal, it was a state-level conspiracy. News broke fast. Headlines read, "Federal grants diverted in Maplewood shooting case." Commentators asked the obvious question, if the mayor's office was taking money, how much did they know about the department's misconduct? Protesters in Maplewood cheered the exposure, but fear rippled through City Hall. The mayor tried to distance himself, claiming ignorance, but Marcus wasn't buying it. He recognized the pattern: money stolen, accountability dodged, blame pushed downward. The second twist cut even deeper. A whistleblower inside the sheriff's office stepped forward. This officer admitted that Reed had been investigated years earlier for assaulting another teenager during a traffic stop. That case never saw court because evidence had gone missing. And who had buried it? The same police chief who now faced fraud charges. Suddenly, Imani's shooting didn't look like a mistake. It looked like the latest chapter in a long cover-up to protect violent officers. When reporters pressed the district attorney about why those older cases had vanished, she fumbled. Then came the leak. Emails showing she had been pressured by donors connected to the same political network tied to the mayor. The corruption Marcus was uncovering wasn't isolated. It was systemic. The same names appeared across different offices, all tied together by money and influence. The third twist landed like a hammer. Federal investigators revealed that Maplewood PD had been running what they called a ghost docket. Arrests of black residents were logged, charges inflated, and fines collected, but many of those cases never went through the court system. The money disappeared into off-the-books accounts. It was organized theft, carried out under the color of law. Families who had complained were ignored or intimidated. And now, with evidence in hand, the DOJ called it what it was: a criminal enterprise disguised as a police department. For Marcus, the revelations were bitter but not surprising. He had warned colleagues for years that corruption often spread far beyond the officers on the street. Now, the proof was in plain sight, tied to his daughter's shooting. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. He wanted accountability. He wanted real change. That change came slowly, in waves. The DOJ placed Maplewood PD under direct federal supervision. Officers were suspended. Supervisors resigned. The mayor faced a grand jury investigation. But Marcus didn't celebrate yet. He had seen too many cases stall once cameras moved on. This time, he wanted reforms locked in so the next family wouldn't live his nightmare. His response was calculated. Instead of just talking to the press, he testified before Congress. He held up Imani's picture as he told lawmakers how federal funds meant to protect the vulnerable had been stolen, and how that theft ended in gunfire against his child. His voice didn't shake. He didn't scream. He laid out the facts with the calm precision of a man who had built cases his entire life. By the end, senators from both parties were calling Maplewood a wake-up call for the nation. Meanwhile, Imani was slowly recovering. She could open her eyes, squeeze her father's hand, even write short notes. The world wanted to hear from her, but Marcus kept her shielded. "She'll speak when she's ready," he told reporters. "And when she does, you'll understand why this fight matters." The pressure didn't stop at Maplewood. Other towns across the state began facing questions. Reporters filed records requests for their grant spending, their training logs, their complaint histories. What Marcus had triggered wasn't just an investigation, it was a domino effect. Police chiefs who thought they were safe now scrambled to explain missing money, falsified reports, and excessive force cases they had buried. The system was unraveling. The fourth twist came from Washington itself. Federal investigators disclosed that Maplewood wasn't the only department running ghost dockets. At least 3 other small-town forces were caught using similar schemes: fake charges, inflated fines, missing records. Maplewood was no longer just a tragedy. It was the center of a nationwide investigation. Imani's name was now tied to hearings on Capitol Hill, civil rights lawsuits, and calls for stronger federal oversight. But for Marcus, the most powerful response wasn't political. It was personal. One evening, he returned to the hospital after another long day of meetings. He sat by Imani's bed, held her hand, and signed the same words he had signed since day one. "You're not alone. They hear you now." This time, she looked at him and slowly signed back. "I know." The moment hit harder than any courtroom victory. His daughter wasn't just surviving. She was reclaiming her voice in the only language that had ever mattered to her. And Marcus knew then that their fight wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about making sure the world understood that silence is not defiance, and that disability is not a crime. The protests in Maplewood turned into something more permanent. Community leaders formed a civil rights coalition. They set up legal aid for families abused by the system. They demanded body cams in every encounter and independent prosecutors for cases involving police use of force. For once, the town wasn't just reacting, it was building. The officers who shot Imani faced federal charges. The chief was indicted for fraud and obstruction. The mayor's career collapsed under the weight of campaign finance scandals. And the DOJ began drafting new rules requiring proof of disability training in any department receiving federal funds. Maplewood had gone from a symbol of corruption to a blueprint for reform. Marcus never claimed victory. He knew the system was bigger than one case, but he also knew something had changed. America had seen the footage. America had seen the cover-up collapse. And America had seen a father refuse to let his daughter's silence be twisted into guilt. By the end, Maplewood wasn't just a headline. It was a warning to every department that thought lies could outlast the truth. And it was a lesson to every community that one case, one family, could push the entire system into the light. Weeks later, Maplewood looked different. The courthouse steps that once echoed with chants and clashes now carried a different kind of sound. Conversations, organizing, planning. Community leaders met under the same oak trees where protests began, not with riot shields in front of them, but with notebooks and microphones. People weren't gathering to mourn anymore. They were gathering to rebuild. Inside the hospital, Imani was stronger. The machines were gone. She could sit up, scribble notes, and use sign language with more energy than before. When Marcus walked into her room one morning, she signed her first full sentence since the shooting. "I'm ready to go home." For him, nothing in Washington, no federal reform, could match that moment. His daughter was alive, healing, and still fighting. But recovery was not simple. Imani struggled with fear. Sudden noises made her jump. At night, she woke from nightmares, her hands shaking. Marcus saw the weight she carried, and he knew it wasn't just about bullets. It was about dignity, about a system that had treated her silence as guilt. That truth couldn't be erased, but it could be transformed into change. And change was happening. The DOJ placed Maplewood PD under direct oversight. Officers were removed. Training programs were enforced. The stolen federal money triggered new state laws requiring transparency. Civil rights groups used Imani's case as evidence in hearings across the country. And slowly, Maplewood became a symbol not just of what went wrong, but of how a community could push back. One evening, Marcus brought Imani to the courthouse. The square was busy, not with protests, but with town meetings. Parents brought their kids. College students set up booths about civil rights. Local leaders discussed reforms. Strangers approached Imani to thank her. Some said, "Because of you, my daughter will be safer." Others said, "You made them listen." She signed thank you to each one. For the first time, she wasn't seen as a victim. She was seen as a voice. Marcus stood beside her, watching. He realized that the real victory wasn't in the arrests or the headlines. It was in the way people now looked at his daughter. Not with pity, not with suspicion, but with respect. Maplewood had tried to silence her. Instead, she had forced them to hear her in the loudest way possible. When reporters asked Marcus what lesson should be remembered, he kept it simple. Silence is not resistance. My daughter is deaf, but she spoke louder than all of them. And if we don't learn from that, nothing will change. His words traveled beyond Maplewood. They were repeated on news shows, printed in classrooms, and written into speeches. For Marcus, the fight wasn't about fame or politics. It was about making sure what happened to Imani never happened again. And for Imani, the fight was about living, creating, and dreaming again. As they walked past the courthouse that night, she tapped his shoulder, smiled, and signed one word: future. Marcus, the story of Maplewood.